good morning. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. My name's Tom, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Yesterday, we began just initially chapter 9, of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, having to do with the Jesuit intrigues in India. We've covered their machinations in France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, England, and how the Jesuits were regarded with odium in nearly all of Europe, and eventually was suppressed and destroyed by a papal bull by Pope Clement XIV. But now we're going to talk about their intrigues in India, having essentially raised up all kinds of public odium against them in Europe. We're now going to move into an area of the world that was not well observed by Europe, and that is their missionary work in India. Going to a different phase of Jesuit history now. Now, since we only got started yesterday, I'll begin at the beginning of the chapter, on page 152, if you're following along in your copy of the book. It says, the reader who shall intelligently trace the history of the Jesuits through their conspiracies against the peace of Europe, and especially their tireless efforts to eradicate everything that tended to freedom of conscience and the public enlightenment, will not wonder that during the last century it became necessary to the interests of society and of the Church that one of the foremost of the popes should suppress and entirely abolish the order. And as that event was brought about, not alone on the account of the odium they incurred by intermeddling with the temporal affairs of states, but because they pursued practices which shocked the whole Christian world, their society cannot be thoroughly understood without becoming familiar with the history of their missionary enterprises. So now we're going to talk about the missionary work of the Jesuits. Remember, early in their founding, Ignatius Loyola, who was truly in opposition of the papacy, sought to be regarded as the voice of God, infallible, and God in the flesh to his Jesuit recruits, which tended to insult the Pope, who was supposed to be the only divine and infallible voice in the Church. And so this raised suspicion with the papacy. But in order to appease the papacy, Ignatius Loyola added to the Constitution that they would go anywhere in the world at the behest of the Pope to spread the faith, Roman Catholicism. In other words, they would be missionaries. So this is the portion of that Constitution we're dealing with, their missionary purposes. Now, he continues, as they prosecuted these among ignorant and illiterate multitudes of people, where no watchful eye could observe them, they have mainly become their own historians. Yet there is enough to be discovered to show that at every stage of their development, they have been true to the injunction of their founder to be, quote, all things to all men. So the point I want to make out with this last sentence is that all of the operations of the Jesuits in India were outside of the observation of anybody in Europe. And so the Jesuits were left to write their own history about their affairs in India. And we're going to see a character of lying taking place out of the stories that were written about by the Jesuit order about their activities in India. They're not being scrutinized as they were in Europe. There are not other historians writing their history from direct observation. The Jesuits are left alone in India to write their own history. So you know it's going to be a history in the best light of the Jesuits. Putting forth the best light of the Jesuits. Now, if I can get this frog out of my throat, we'll continue. Ignatius Loyola considered his society superior to the ancient monastic orders. This has been repeated throughout the book. Ignatius Loyola viewed the Jesuit order to be the only true, faithful, obedient, and holy order of the Roman Catholic Church. And he regarded all the other monastic orders of being corrupt and inept and imbecilic, including the papacy. Now, he says, we have seen that he looked upon the latter as corrupted, that is, the monastic orders, as corrupted, and no longer worthy to be entrusted with the work of Christian missions, on which account he claimed for his society superior jurisdiction in the missionary field. So he said, just these other monastic orders just are not worthy to be missionaries for the church. Only the Jesuit order can be missionaries for the church. And he says, there among populations unable to detect imposture, his followers had their own way, made their own history, and executed their own purposes without intelligent popular inspection. Okay, so they're outside of the watchful eyes of their critics in Europe, and they're allowed to do pretty much as they please and even write their own history. Now he says, consequently, when he realized the odium his society had encountered among European peoples, he considered it necessary to remove this by setting up for it exaggerated claims of merit in the missionary work. By this means, he evidently hoped to be able to appeal successfully to the Pope and to the Church to protect the Jesuits from the rising indignation of such Christians as had resisted their entrance into France. Okay, they found lots of opposition in France, lots of condemnation, and lots of suspicion, and lots of resistance. And they didn't want this to take place anymore. Okay, they wanted a free hand, so they found a free society that was free of any observance by their critics. And he says, hence it became a fixed Jesuit habit, and yet is, to shield the society, the Jesuit order, under pretense that it is a necessary part of the church machinery, and that the church cannot exist without it. And out of that same necessity must have grown that multitude of miracles said to have been performed in remote and unfrequented parts of the world, and in the manufacture of which the Jesuits have acquired the reputation of being thorough adepts. They are thorough adepts at writing their own glorious history, as we're about to discover. It was not a difficult matter in those days to impose upon superstitious people by the claim of miraculous power. None understood this better than the Jesuits. The first important mission of the Jesuits was to the East Indies, in charge of Francis Xavier, one of the most impressionable of Loyola's converts. This mission is of chief importance, inasmuch as it was initiatory and conspicuously displays the operations of the society while under the immediate personal charge of its founder. It indicates the methods of the Jesuit missionary system and how they were made to conform to the main purpose of acquiring dominion, with but little regard to the means employed. There are very few of the present age who do not regard many of the recorded events as apocryphal, notwithstanding the over-credulous have accepted them as true for many centuries. They are only important now because we learn from them the prominent characteristics of the Jesuits and the real foundation of the reputation to which they so boastingly lay claim. The Portuguese had, for some years before, acquired the occupancy of territory in India, with a commercial capital and an episcopal see at Goa. By means of these influences, a number of the natives had professed Christianity, rather Catholicism, and, along with all the Portuguese Christians, paid spiritual allegiance to the Pope. But the condition of society was by no means favorable to the practice of the Christian virtues. On the contrary, it had become greatly immoral, rivaling Rome and the principal cities of Europe in that respect. Now, this is typical of Roman Catholicism. Immorality reigns. And this is exactly what the Jesuits found when they injected themselves into India and began to deal with the so-called Christian community that had been proselytized by the so-called monastic orders, who were likewise corrupt. So they found the same corruptions in India under the monastic orders that they found in Europe under the monastic orders. It says in, quote, the lives of the saints, unquote. This is a historical work, a work that may be read. It's entitled The Lives of the Saints. It's a Roman Catholic work. It describes it as a work of standard ecclesiastical authority in the Roman Catholic Church. The author represents, quote, revenge, ambition, avarice, usury, and debauchery, unquote, as extensively prevailing at Goa. So, an accepted Roman Catholic document entitled The Lives of the Saints depicts this immorality that prevailed in this Christian province, this Roman Catholic province of Goa. Now, according to him, the Indians who had professed conversion were so influenced by the example of the Portuguese that they had relapsed into their ancient manners and superstitions. Even those who professed to be Christians, quote, lived in direct opposition to the gospel which they professed, and by their manners alienated the infidels from the faith, unquote. So this is the extent of the immorality and the results. Christianity was falling into disfavor. It was immoral. Now, those familiar with the condition of ecclesiastical affairs in Europe at that time, and especially with the immorality prevailing at Rome, will not be surprised at this description of things at so remote a place as the Portuguese possessions in India. Of course, such tendency to demoralization or immorality could not long exist anywhere without producing absolute social degradation. To prevent this, the King of Portugal made an attempt to reform those abuses, influenced probably by the twofold purpose of desiring to spread Christianity and to improve the commercial interests of his subjects. Francis Xavier, therefore, was sent to India under his auspices, and was better fit for that purpose than Ignatius Loyola himself would have been, because he was less ambitious, less selfish, and more conscientious. While he possessed some commendable traits of character and wonderful energy, much that has been written about him by papal and Jesuit authors can only be considered as imaginary, and as deserving no permanent place in history. The character assigned to him is perfectly angelic, with scarcely any mixture of humanity. And like Ignatius Loyola, he is represented as having performed a vast number of miracles, even to the extent of restoring the dead to life. With regard to these, he is said to have resembled Loyola in another respect, in that he too performed more miracles than Jesus Christ himself. It's not difficult to perceive the object of all this when it is considered that the pretenses were set up at a time when an unenlightened public were easily misled by them. Continuing, he says, They, like the innumerable myths of the Middle Ages, answered the ends of their inventors, and are no further useful now than as they serve to show not only the character of the society which required them to be accepted as absolutely true, but that of those who invented and employed them to mislead the credulous and unsuspecting multitudes. So the Jesuits, writing their own history, have just elevated Francis Xavier to a god, having performed all these miracles, to give credit to the Jesuit order and reverence to the Jesuit order, to elevate them within the Roman Catholic Church, even at a period of time when they were almost universally hated in Europe, even by the papacy. Now, the entire account of Francis Xavier's mission is so mixed up with these idle tales that the time spent in their perusal would be wasted, but for the reason that they bring prominently before us some of the distinguishing characteristics of the Jesuits under the tuition and during the lives of the founder of their society, Ignatius Loyola, as his most confidential colleague. Francis Xavier was the right-hand man of Ignatius Loyola. Now, when he reached Goa, Francis Xavier found the Portuguese Christians in the demoralized condition already mentioned. The order of Franciscans had there an established monastery, which, as we may suppose, needed to be reformed, inasmuch as they do not seem to have been accepted, E-X-C-E-P-T-E-D, accepted or excluded from other professing Christians in the general charge of immorality. So the Franciscans, who had this monastery in Goa, were corrupt, immoral, and they were just like all the other corrupt and immoral monastic orders of the Roman Catholic Church. And the society in Goa, under their influence, was likewise corrupt because of their example. Okay? They make Christ a minister of unrighteousness, right? In a Christian nation, should not Christian virtue reign within the realm? And why is it that we see constantly throughout history that when under Roman Catholic influence, corruption, moral depravity is the defining characteristic? It's because it's not the Church of Jesus Christ, never has been, and never will be. And neither is it a Christian nation when the Jesuits are in influence. Now he says, we do not learn from Jesuit authors how far this order was in fact reformed, since the eulogists of Francis Xavier consider it to have been his great glory that he brought vast multitudes of the natives into the Christian fold and thereby established Jesuit authority and dominion in India in place of that which the Church, under the patronage of the Pope and by means of long-established religious orders, had already acquired there. This was manifestly the view which Francis Xavier himself took for his mission, as is plainly shown by his conduct. In other words, he's going into this Christian community that was made Christian by the monastic orders and by the Pope and by the Church, and to whip it into shape. Okay? This is exactly the same attitude that Ignatius Loyola had when he founded the Jesuit order in the beginning. To whip the Church, the monastic orders, the whole Christian world into shape. Okay? The epitome of virtue, Ignatius Loyola, is going to undo the filth and immorality of the Roman Catholic Church. This is the same attitude the Jesuits had in India. Now, instead of cooperating with the established church authorities and with the monks at Goa, he entered upon an independent course of his own, whereby he evidently intended to indicate the superiority of his Jesuit methods. He roamed the streets with a bell in his hands, and when the ringing attracted a crowd of curious lookers-on, He invited them, quote, to send their children and slaves to catechism, unquote, so as to learn the truths of Christianity from him. When the children gathered around him, prompted alone by curiosity, he taught them, quote, the creed and practices of devotion, unquote, which, of course, could have been nothing more than the simplest form. After following this method for some time, he engaged in public preaching, and it is gravely said that, quote, in half an hour, unquote, he accomplished the, quote, reformation of the whole city of Goa, unquote, which must have included the native along with the Portuguese population. The whole story is told after the manner of the Romance writers. So here we see the first acts of the Jesuits who are writing their own history, saying that in a half an hour, Francis Xavier converted the whole Christian community, including the immoral Portuguese that had polluted the place, right? In a half an hour. You know, what was that saying that we say? Yeah, that's the ticket. Anyway, it says, reflecting people who read of the immense multitudes converted to Christianity under this eloquent preaching, not only at Goa, but in other parts of India, will naturally wonder how all this could have occurred when the natives did not even understand his language, nor he theirs. But the Jesuits have no difficulty on that score, nor indeed on any other, when the simple invention of a miracle will serve their purpose. Francis Xavier became as famous as Ignatius Loyola in this respect. Butler, the historian, represents him as having, quote, baptized 10,000 Indians with his own hand in 1 month, unquote, and also, quote, sometimes a whole village, unquote, in a single day, and as, quote, having preached to 5,000 or 6,000 persons together, unquote, but without stating in what language he preached. Okay? He's in India, right? He doesn't speak the language of the Indians, nor he his, nor they his. And in spite of the linguistic, the total lack of ability to comprehend and to communicate with these people, he converts entire villages in a single day. Now he says, seemingly, however, to anticipate that there might be some to inquire how much of real Christianity there was in these professed conversions, and how he could have preached with so much effect to those whose language he could not speak and who could not understand his, he endeavors to remove the difficulty, evidently following the Jesuit story, by declaring that while in India, quote, God first communicated to him the gift of tongues, so that, quote, he spoke very well the language of the barbarians without having learned it, and had no need for an interpreter when he instructed them, unquote. It is impossible now to decide how this statement originated. Francis Xavier reported only to Ignatius Loyola, not to the Pope or to the Church, and whatever was circulated in Europe to aid the cause of the Jesuits and to gain them popularity on account of the success of their missions was derived from him. Okay, I missed the cue. We'll be back for after the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I pledge allegiance to the King of Kings, and to his kingdom come, on earth as it is in heaven, one holy nation, under Heavenly Father, grace, mercy, justice for all.
In In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find, but investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. We're talking about the history of the Jesuits in India and how Francis Xavier, upon entering India, started converting everybody to Catholicism. And obviously, these are made-up stories of the successes of the Jesuits in converting the Indians to Catholicism, when in fact Francis Xavier didn't know the language of the people, and neither did they understand his language. And the Jesuits are prepared for any incredulous questions about how it was that such miraculous conversions by Francis Xavier could have occurred when there's such a language barrier. And so the Jesuits are ready with a tall tale. It is ascribed to Francis Xavier that God communicated to him the gift of tongues, so that he spoke very well the languages of the barbarians without having heard it, and had no need for an interpreter when he instructed them. Okay? That's how the Jesuits cover their successes, that God blessed them with the ability to speak in their foreign language without ever having time to learn the language themselves. Okay? And R.W. Thompson says, it is impossible now to decide how this statement originated. Xavier reported only to Ignatius Loyola, not to the Pope or to the Church. And whatsoever was circulated in Europe to aid the cause of the Jesuits and to gain them popularity on account of the success of their missions was derived from him. So all the information coming out of India from Francis Xavier goes directly to Ignatius Loyola. Now, do you think Ignatius is going to scrutinize any of this? Especially when it is so favorable to the Jesuits, especially at a time when the Jesuits were hated all over Europe by the Roman Catholics of all Europe. They hated them. So the Pope doesn't have any direct information. The Church doesn't have any direct information because all the direct information is going strictly to Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuit general, the god of the Jesuits, the only infallible head of the Jesuits. And he's writing the history of Francis Xavier in India. Now, the author continues. He says, but whether it originated with Xavier or Loyola, or was invented after the death of both, neither the repetition of it now, nor its recent appearance in an authoritative ecclesiastical volume, published and exclusively circulated in the United States, can relieve it from the suspicion of a fabulous origin. Okay? It clearly is suspicious. And nevertheless, it was widely distributed in the United States to glorify the Jesuits in the United States. Now, during the brief stay of Francis Xavier in Goa, he availed himself of the opportunity of setting an example which the Jesuits of every subsequent period have been prompt to imitate, an example which gives practical interpretation to the Jesuit vow of extreme poverty. The Franciscan monks had erected a seminary where they taught the native youths at least the rudiments of a Christian education. But Francis Xavier was not satisfied with this, having manifestly conceived the idea, still maintained by the Jesuits today, that the cause of education should be entrusted solely to them on account of their superiority over all others, including every religious order. Influenced presumably by this consideration alone, he conceived a plan of having the Franciscan seminary turned over to him, with the view of converting it into a Jesuit college. Claiming that he was a more immediate and responsible representative of the Roman Catholic Church than any of the monastic orders, inasmuch as the brief of the Pope conferred special missionary prerogatives upon him, he succeeded in effecting his purpose by inducing the Franciscans to transfer the building to him. Whereupon the Franciscans were left to engage in such other methods as they could minister to the Portuguese Christians and convert the natives, whilst Francis Xavier was permitted to establish his Jesuit college, so that whatsoever renown should follow the Indian missions might inure to the benefit of the Jesuits and not to the monastic orders. The Jesuits have ever since then lost sight of this idea or failed to profit by it, always taking care to make up the history of these missions to place their society in the front and the monastic orders in the background, notwithstanding the latter preceded them in India. They seemed disinclined to allow the least credit to any of the missionary agencies which the Church had been accustomed to employ. Having obtained possession of the Franciscan seminary at Goa, Francis Xavier decided that the building should be improved so as to impress the simple natives with the superiority of the Jesuit over the monks. To an ordinary mind, this would appear to be a difficult thing to accomplish, inasmuch as it is not probable that voluntary contributions could have been procured in such a community. But to Francis Xavier, it was easy to overcome so trivial a difficulty as this, as it always has been to the Jesuits, without finding the least impediment to their vow of extreme poverty. All he had to do was to employ the Portuguese troops. We're using force now. All he had to do was to employ the Portuguese troops stationed at Goa, quote, in pulling down the heathen temples in the neighborhood of Goa and appropriating their very considerable property for the use and benefit of the new college, unquote. Cynically, R.W. Thompson says, admirable strategy. The poor natives were powerless to resist the Portuguese troops with arms in their hands, and were compelled to stand by in silence and see their property despoiled without compensation, all under the pretense that, quote, the greater glory of God, that is, ad majorem Dei gloriam, unquote, required it, when in fact it was prompted by Jesuit ambition. Francis Xavier must have felt gratified in his inexpensive mode of improving his new college, and Loyola undoubtedly rejoiced when the fact was reported to him. The former, therefore, having so successfully occupied the missionary field at Goa by this display of Jesuit power to the natives, and by reducing the Franciscan monks to inferiority, hastened to other parts of India to carry on the work he had begun under such flattering auspices. He proceeded to the coast of Malabar, where the missionaries previously sent from Goa, under the authority and within the jurisdiction of that episcopal see, had baptized a large number of natives whom they claimed to have been converted to Roman Catholicism under the methods employed by them. But in order to make it appear that these missionaries were inefficient and incompetent, the Jesuits pretend that these professed converts still, quote, retained their superstitions and vices, unquote, and that it was absolutely necessary that they should be brought under the influence of Francis Xavier. In other words, they went into this new region, also dominated by the Franciscans, and again, the Jesuits take the role that neither the church nor the Franciscans were able to convert anybody. There was no real effect to their conversions. No change of hearts. Corruption prevailed, and it was up to Francis Xavier to, quote-unquote, whip them into shape. Okay? Make real converts of them. Just simply proving what Ignatius Loyola believed, that the church and all its monastic orders were inept, and that the Jesuit order is the one true, infallible power of Christianity on the earth. Now, it says the purpose of this at that time was to prove to the Christian world that the church and the papacy had failed to accomplish any good missionary results through the agency of the monks, and that the Jesuits were absolutely indispensable. In this way, it was hoped, doubtless, to overcome the prejudice existing against the society, against the Jesuits in Europe. Therefore, Francis Xavier is represented as having saved the Malabar converts from relapsing into heathenism and increased the number of natives who submitted to baptism. Whilst all this is spoken in his praise, it is quite certain from the most favorable accounts that they entertained but little, if any, just conception of the ceremony of baptism, or indeed any of the fundamental principles of Christianity. The first effort of Francis Xavier upon the Malabar coast was at Cape Comorin, in a village full of idolaters, it is said, to whom he preached. But as they were unable to understand what he said, they remained unmoved, having been probably attracted, like the people of Goa, by his bell ringing in the streets. Why the gift of tongues was then withheld from him is not easy to determine, unless it was that he might be furnished an opportunity of impressing the ignorant natives with sentiments of awe by performing a miracle. At all events, Butler records what happened in these words, quote, a woman who had been 3 days in the pains of childbirth, without being eased by any remedies or prayers of the Brahmins, was immediately delivered and recovered upon being instructed in the faith and baptized by St. Francis Xavier. as he himself relates in a letter to St. Ignatius Loyola. So here we have again an example of Francis Xavier communicating directly with Ignatius Loyola this fantastic tale. All an attempt to glorify the Jesuits, make it appear that the Franciscans and the popes and all were inept, and that the church absolutely depended upon the Jesuits for proselytizing and missionary work, and also to offset all the odium in Europe about the Jesuits. Now, how she was instructed in the faith is, of course, not explained, it being left to the imagination of the reader to conceive of what extraordinary process this ignorant woman was instructed in the Christian faith, so that she could be rightly baptized into the church when she did not understand the language in which she was addressed. If she even realized that her safe delivery and instantaneous restoration were occasioned by his intervention, there was no possible mode of conveying to her mind the idea that it was God's work and not Francis Xavier's, for there was no word in any of the language of India signifying the deity in the Christian sense. So Francis Xavier's leaving this appear as though he was the one who healed this woman in pain of delivery, glorifying himself, not giving the glory to God. This is typical of the Jesuits. They preach God out of one side of their mouth, but they serve themselves. Now, the whole story is not only preposterous, but puerile. But it bears the unmistakable stamp of Jesuitism, like others of the same general character. For example, it is seriously recorded by the same author that after the happening of this event, quote, the chief persons of the country listened to his doctrine and heartily embraced the faith, unquote. He preached to those who had never before heard of Christ, quote, and so great were the multitude which he baptized that sometimes by the bare fatigue of administrating the sacrament, that is, baptism, he was scarcely able to move his arms, according to the account which he gave to his brethren in Europe, unquote. He healed the sick by baptism, and where his presence was impractical, he set a neophyte to touch them with a cross, when, if they signified a desire to be baptized, they were restored to health. In addition, it is also said that he brought back to life 4 persons who were dead during the 15 months he remained upon the Malabar coast. Yes, it is claimed that Francis Xavier raised the dead, just like Ignatius Loyola. Now, it said he had preached at Travancore near Cormoran, where he was more favorable by having the gift of tongues given to him, so that he could speak in one language as well as another. Thus endowed with the gift of tongues, as the Jesuits insist, with divine power, he dispersed and drove out of the country a tribe of savages and public robbers who were in search of plunder, by approaching them with a crucifix in his hand, although they had never heard of a crucifix before and had no means of knowing what it signified. When the people of a village near Travancore remained uninfluenced by his preaching, an event not at all wonderful considering their utter ignorance of Christianity, he is represented as having again resorted to a miracle, which was the never-failing Jesuit resource. He had a grave opened, which contained a body interred the day before, and after putrefaction had commenced, restored it to life and, quote-unquote, perfect health. Near the same place he also brought back to life a young man whose corpse he met on the way to the grave. These miracles, says Butler, made so great an impression upon the people that the whole kingdom of Travancore was subjected to Christ in a few months, except the king and some of his courtiers, unquote. Every enlightened mind will reject such tales as pure fiction, as absolutely incredible. They trifle with serious things, and their inventors act in imitation of those who make merchandise of human souls. It directly impeaches the wisdom of Providence to pretend that He permitted miracles to be performed in His name, even the dead to be raised to life, to influence the destiny of an ignorant heathen population, utterly unable to appreciate the character and teaching of Christ, while at the same time He permitted almost every variety of vice and corruption to prevail among the intelligent populations of Europe and to fester about the very heart of the papacy itself. We are to examine the stories of Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier and all their miracles in the context of the total depravity of Roman Catholicism from stem to stern, and ask ourselves seriously, did God offer His grace and His power and His miracles to Francis Xavier and Ignatius Loyola? The answer is clearly no, and these are falsehoods in order to deceive the whole world. And they have. The United States today, especially those, particularly Roman Catholics in our governments, believe these stories. And they rely upon the Jesuits to help them direct their paths in government. And the Jesuits are doing what they have always done. Used cooperative Roman Catholics, captivated with this glamorous story of the Jesuits, representing them as divine oracles. And the Jesuits are using them to make America Catholic by the legislation they pass in this country. The ultimate goal is a union of church and state, a Roman Catholic state, a dictatorial papal state, just as they tried to create in France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, England, and the whole world. Now it says the accounts of what was done by Francis Xavier in the various parts of India are of the same general character as the foregoing, the chief variations being in the kind of miracles performed by him. To minds capable of subjecting them to the test of reason and common sense, it is impossible to avoid the conclusion that they were either invented by Francis Xavier himself and sent to Europe to aid Ignatius Loyola in giving popularity to the Jesuits, or were made up by them after his death for the same purpose. In point of fact, his whole claim to be considered as the apostle of the Indies rests upon a flimsy and unsubstantial foundation. This is especially so in view of the fact that the multitudes he pretended to convert were turned into professing Christians by the simple ceremony of baptism. Some of them may possibly have been able to repeat the invocations of Our Father and Hail Mary, but without any intelligent conception of the differences between the one omnipotent God of the Christians and the many gods they had been accustomed to worship, or of the meanings of the words uttered to them by Francis Xavier, or of the sacraments he administered, or of any of the attributes of the deity, or of a single essential principle of the Christian creed. Nevertheless, other accounts are added, whereby he is represented as having visited other places upon the Indian coast where like results are said to have been produced, until after having remained about 7 years in the East Indies, he went to Japan to bring that idolatrous nation under the same influences, leaving the bulk of his Indian converts to succumb to the dominion of the Brahmins and sink back into heathenism. He did not seem to realize that true conversion to the Christian faith involves the sympathetic emotions of the heart, the intelligent actions of the mind, and that without these, no signs or genuflections or empty words spoken merely from the lips can give substantial value to the profession of it. A knowledge of the manual of arms does not impart to a coward the bravery of a true soldier, nor does the repetition of a few familiar words convert a parrot into an intelligent being. And not a whit more can a heathen who never heard of Christ be converted into a Christian by any form of words or by any bodily gestures unless his mind has been touched and his heart stirred by some knowledge of what and who God is, and of the wisdom of his providences displayed in the creation and government of the universe. One would suppose that the quote-unquote gift of tongues, when once conferred upon Francis Xavier, remained with him, inasmuch as he could not convey his thoughts to the multitudes of people in any other way. But strange to say, it was otherwise. This miraculous gift was a mere, quote, transient favor, unquote, conferred only for a season, during his intercourse with some of the heathen populations of India, and then withdrawn as miraculously as it had been given. What strange infatuation it must be to accept it as true that after he had been divinely endowed with the faculty of preaching to the people of India in their own languages, he should have entered upon his mission to Japan without any knowledge whatsoever of the Japanese language. Although that language is one of the most difficult in the world and wholly unlike any spoken then or now in Europe, yet that fact was of trifling consequence to such a man as the Jesuits represents Xavier to have been. He undertook his mission as if nothing were in the way, relying, as may be inferred from Jesuit accounts, upon his miraculous powers to convert to Christianity an idolatrous people he had never seen and whom the world at that time knew little about. It is solemnly averred that in 40 days, he acquired a sufficient knowledge of the Japanese language to translate it into the popular Apostles' Creed and an exposition of its meaning by himself. With this he began to preach and converted a great number, so they say. Still, the intensity of his zeal made him impatient, and being unwilling to await the slow process of appealing to the intelligence of the Japanese people, he resorted again to the familiar expedients of miracles, which had accomplished so much in India. Of course they did. Accordingly, we are also told that, quote, by his blessing, a child's body, which was swelled and deformed, was made straight and beautiful by his prayers. Okay, I hear the music. We've run out of time. We'll back up a little bit tomorrow and continue. Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.